So this is the final Star Pack event of the League of Women Voters Keys to the Capitol Day, celebrating our 98th anniversary of the founding of the League in the same year as the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. We're delighted to have you all here today. Our panel this afternoon is on gerrymandering, and we're also very delighted to have a very illustrious and highly qualified panel to talk about the issues to do with apportionment, partisan gerrymandering, extreme partisan gerrymandering, the Supreme Court cases that are now moving through the federal courts. And so let me introduce our guests very briefly, and then we'll get right into the meat of the matter. Dmitry Bam, oh, this is his name, or Dmitry's here. Dmitry writes and teaches in the fields of constitutional law, professional responsibility, employment law, and judiciary. He's the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and a professor at Maine Law. He's a recognized scholar and commentator on judicial ethics, judicial selection, and constitutional interpretation. And we want him here today to talk a little bit about the cases, the basis for the cases that are moving through the courts. So welcome, Dmitry. Thank you for joining us. Dave Feldman, right here, is on the faculty at the College of the Atlantic in the fields of physics and mathematics. He has been at the College of the Atlantic since 1998, is that correct? Oh my gosh. Served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs from 2003 to 2007, and he's taught over 20 different courses in math, science, and computer sciences. So he's here to help us understand a little bit better about the math behind the efficiency gap and some of the other tests for partisan gerrymandering and some of the other mathematical models that can be used for fair apportionment. Down on that far end there is Professor Richard Powell. He's a professor at the University of Maine in Orono, director of the Cohen Institute for Leadership and Public Service, and has written a book or two about gerrymandering, right?
Books on other topics, articles and conference papers and stuff.
About gerrymandering. Yes. So and he's bringing both a mathematical as well as a political science perspective to the discussion. So we're going to have a bunch of good perspectives here. And then last but not least is Richard Taylor. Richard is the Communications and Research Manager for the Maine Housing Authority, where he's been since 2013. Prior to that, he worked as a Senior Research and Planning Analyst for the Maine Fire Marshal and Maine Department of Public Safety. He's here because he has direct experience with the census in Maine. And all of this apportionment stuff rests on the census. And right now, the 2020 census is in a little bit of a controversial spot. So, we're going to build this major apportionment edifice on a little bit of a shaky foundation as things now stand, and that's why Richard is here to represent us today. So I'm going to let each of them say a brief statement of introduction about themselves and their background, more than what I just said. We'll get into some questions, and we'll just have a very conversation amongst the moderator and the panel, and we're going to reserve plenty of time for audience questions at the end, so stay tuned for that. Okay, ready? Okay, so we'll just go right down the line. If you want to say more than what I offered in the introduction, Dave, go ahead.
Sure. So I'm Dave Feldman. I teach math and physics at College of the Atlantic over in Bar Harbor. And I've been interested in gerrymandering for around a year. I participated in a conference workshop, a week-long workshop at Tufts last summer that was fascinating and made new colleagues and friends, and have been sort of studying the issue since then. And so I sort of bring a mathematical and computational eye to things. But I guess one of the things I'll say to start off that is this is most definitely not purely a mathematical question. To me, what is so fascinating about it, and what I think we'll bring up in the discussion, is that math and computer science have a lot to offer, but it's also an unavoidably political question and an unavoidably legal question. And it has a rich history as well. And so all of those things tied together, all are things I like to think about, even with my background in math. And so I'm looking forward to a fun discussion, and thank you all for being here.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I guess I would characterize myself as an extensive data user and primarily a census data user. I've been using it since I was a graduate student in constitutional history. A long time ago, I used it for the first time in working in public safety and other state agencies, federal government agencies, I've used it extensively too. So to me, it's extremely important. And it was used originally for setting up districts, but I never really looked at it much from that perspective. For me, it's been about making policy where you're going to put out housing development, for instance. So it's very, very important to me.
Well, so as Ann said, I teach constitutional law, and kind of the issues around gerrymandering are kind of the core issues when we talk about the Constitution, right? So one of the kind of the defining central issues in constitutional law is about the role of the courts, right? When should the court be involved in reviewing actions of state legislature or actions of Congress, right? And so this is a debate around abortion, Roe v. Wade, campaign finance. Really every issue kind of implicates this. But the role of the court here is really central. The court has struggled to try to figure out where it fits in reviewing districting, right? And in some areas, when it's racial gerrymandering, when race has played a predominant role in drawing lines, the court has become more active. Here, the court has not been as active, but really for decades now, the court has been struggling to find a place for itself, and that's where the legal issues really fit in.
Richard?
Yeah, so again, I'm Rich Powell from the University of Maine, and I've been working on various aspects of American elections for the past 20 to 25 years, and over time evolved quite a bit of interest in gerrymandering and reapportionment. I've been working with a team of researchers here in Maine and also at MIT for about the past 3 or 4 years, doing some really interesting simulations that tell us quite a bit about, I'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit, about what some of the possibilities are out there, but also gives us a better baseline, I would argue, than some of the other measures that are out there for now about how we can actually assess whether or not a particular state is gerrymandered in its redistricting patterns. So I think I originally met Ann about 15 years ago. At the time, we had just published a book on term limits in the state of Maine. Unfortunately, term limits has kind of well, I'll stay neutral on whether it's unfortunate that term limits remain. I've been good about avoiding that argument over the years and have talked more about the impact. But it's run its course at least, and is no longer the same sort of hot issue that it was for a long time. So that was something that I got to do for a long time, and have moved on to other things since then.
Just for the record, the League of Women Voters has opposed term limits from the beginning, filed suit to have them overturned. We lost that suit. We still oppose term limits. We're waiting for our moment. So I think I'd like to ask you to start off, Dave, because you have this really big handout here. And my first question on the list is, what's the difference of gerrymandering? How does it work? Talk to us about packing and cracking. And it looks like your handout is going to get right at that. So why don't you do it?
Sure. So I can start by saying a little bit about what gerrymandering is and a couple of key terms that we'll probably all use. And the first figure on the handout, you may want to refer to it. And the colors did not go from color to black and white very well. So it says red and blue. If it doesn't look red and blue to you, that's not your fault.
We'll keep our Facebook Live people in mind as you walk through this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so the scenario here is, and this is a plot, many of you might have seen this. This was in the Washington Post and has made the rounds on a lot of different outlets. The question is, if we have, say, a state that is 60% blue and 40% red, how should, and there are 5 districts, how should we divide those up? And in this really simple graph, things are never this simple in the real world, you could imagine very easily on the graph on the paper, coming up with 3 blue and 2 red. And that seems fair because it's a 60% blue region and you get 60% blue seats. So that seems reasonable. Notice, however, that those districts are not going to be at all competitive. And that's something also that we sometimes desire in our districting. We want legislators actually have to listen to us when we call them. And competitive elections is one way to have it happen. And so if you, and we'll probably get into this more later, if you want to enforce proportionality, you often end up doing so at the expense of competitiveness. You could also divide things in the other direction on the map here, and then that would end up having all of the districts being blue and none of them being red. And that seems unfair as well. There's 40% red in this little universe. They should have some representation in whatever form this is. Notice, though, that these are more, all of these districts are now a little bit competitive, right? So they're all 60-40, so you could imagine some way that they might tip and be competitive in the other sense. And so a competitive district is one that tends to be balanced fairly closely. And so then if there's a swing, you actually might expect all of those competitive districts to go in the other way, leading to something that's not at all proportional. So I think the first point is that proportionality and competitiveness are actually often, those are things we often say we want out of districting. Very often you can't have them both at the same time. This is a hard problem. Politically, it's a hard problem mathematically. The last plot, number 3 on the sheet, shows some sort of wiggly lines, and this would be maybe a gerrymandered case where actually the party that's in the minority ends up actually having the majority of seats. And there's 2 sort of ways that happens. The majority, you pack them all, or as many of them as you can, into 1 or 2 districts. So you'll notice the blues, who in this figure are actually light gray, are all packed into 90% blue districts. And then it turns out that the remaining 3 districts are majority red. And so we would say that we're packed 2 districts, and then the remaining blue voters are cracked, i.e. spread across the other 3. So that's packing and cracking, and a few thoughts about competitiveness versus proportionality. Maybe I should take a breath here.
No, that's good, and let me ask Rich on the other end to talk about gerrymandering defined, packing, cracking, and I mean apportionment is one thing, gerrymandering is something else.
I think Dave's done a great job in introducing the basics of the concept, and starts what you see with his diagrams here. It starts to get at some of the real problem in terms of defining it, or at least identifying whether or not something's been gerrymandered in the real world. And you see a lot of really sort of simplistic discussions about this using broad stroke aggregate data, where people, the sort of in Dave's example, if you look at the 60% blue and the 40% red here, they're very, in this particular diagram, the squares, which we could think of as individuals or groups of individuals sharing similar political characteristics, are very tightly grouped, which is actually important. And if Dave were to generate a diagram in which the darks and the lights, or the reds and the blues, were kind of evenly distributed and randomly distributed about the space, it would have very different implications. So what that means is oftentimes you'll see in the popular press, well, a particular state might have, we'll just pick some numbers out of the blue. So 55% of the voters tend to vote Democratic, and 45% of the voters tend to vote Republican, and yet Republicans have more seats in the House of Representatives, which seems to offend people's ideas about, having some sort of a proportional balance or sort of fair outcome based upon the overall partisanship of the state. There are a number of things that complicate that. And Dmitry will talk about some of the legal complications that can result, and those translate into the options that are available to people who are drawing district boundaries. But this sort of diagram nicely illustrates some of the very initial problems, some of the basic problems with this, in the sense that it matters how people are distributed spatially. And if you have non-overlapping single-member districts like we do in the United States, we don't have a system whereby, say, in Maine, or even a larger state, say with 10 seats in the House of Representatives, where there's a statewide vote and we just kind of divide up the seats proportionally. That's not how we do it. We have districts that do not overlap, and each one of those districts elects one member. And so the distribution of the partisans across the space geographically within a state matters. It matters a lot. And we can talk about some of the reasons why that's true. So, we would argue, and I think most of the people doing work on gerrymandering would argue today, that it's not enough to just simply say, well, the seats don't match the voters. Because oftentimes it's not even possible to draw districts that would correspond proportionally to to the voter, the overall identification of the voters. And just to sort of bring this home in the most important real-world sense for American politics, Democrats tend to be disproportionately clustered in very large urban areas. And Republicans are spread out much more evenly across the landscape in the other places. And that presents some very difficult problems for people drawing district boundaries if their attempt is to draw boundaries that sort of proportionally represent the partisans in the overall electorate of that state. And it particularly creates some problems for Democrats in their ability to be represented in the House in ways that are equal to their numbers in the electorate. So we have an approach in our research, which we can talk about this afternoon, that doesn't just look at the seats versus the overall electorate, but it looks at the districts as they are drawn now relative to a randomized sampling of all the districts that theoretically could be drawn. We're not really interested in districts that can't exist in the real world, and they don't tell us that much of importance, at least in terms of what you could have and not have, in terms of the distribution of seats. And we're talking. My work is on the House of Representatives, but this applies to state legislatures also.
Well, I mean, this has been going on for a long time, and the courts have been involved for a long time, as you said, Dmitry, in terms of racial gerrymandering and protecting the ability of black communities to elect some black representatives. But and I want you to talk about that. But I mean, it seems like we are seeing a wave of, I'll call it extreme partisan gerrymandering after the 2010 election, and so some of the state maps that got drawn after that are the ones that are coming up for challenge. So to talk about the court's history a little bit, and then we'll come back around to some of these other concepts.
Yeah, so if you look back to before 1964, when the court announces the one person, one vote rule, you had states that did redistrict for long stretches of time, so they had very unequal districts, and that's what most of the country looked like, so this really wasn't an issue until then. In 1964, the court decided a case called Reynolds v. Sims, and that's a case, maybe the most important case in the court's history. I mean, it really redefined politics in the United States, and it required every single state to go back and every 10 years to redraw its lines and figure out how it's going to redistrict. That's the case that held that one person, one vote is required under the Constitution, under the Equal Protection Clause. And when the court was grappling with this issue about whether to go in that direction, there was a lot of nail biting on the court. Do we want to get involved? Justice Frankfurter said we should stay out of this. This is a political thicket. This is not a place for the court to get in. And in part, you can see on this map, there's an infinite number of ways that the lines can be drawn, and none of them are inherently right? Inherently right or inherently wrong. And so the argument was, this is a political question, kind of a pure political question, and the court will be unable to get itself out of this thicket. When the court announces the rule and the states go back and redraw their lines, the kind of the initial uses of this are to racially gerrymander, right? So to try to draw lines in a way that disenfranchise African American voters or draw African American voters out of specific districts. And so kind of a classic case, you have a line drawn and you take the African American community and you just draw them out of your district, right? And so there the court had an easier time with the rule because the standard was you shouldn't consider race at all. And that's consistent with the way the court approached Brown v. Board of Education, right, desegregation. And so under the Equal Protection Clause, race is a suspect class. The government should not make decisions, pass laws, make any other decisions based on race. And so the court could say, well, you shouldn't consider race in your line drawing. Once you get to the political piece, that's where the court has run into a stumbling block. Because not only is political partisanship not necessarily protected class in the way that race or gender or national origin is, but it's one where the court has seemed to assume that it's okay to consider politics in some ways as kind of one of the factors, but once you consider it as a factor, you don't know where the stopping line is, right? And so for now, over a couple of decades, you've had these challenges to partisan gerrymandering, and they come to the court, and the court initially started hinting that if it goes too far, it goes too far, we'll step in. But then in the most recent cases, over a decade ago now, you had 4 justices in the court that say, we can't figure out a test here. There's really no formula to decide what's right and what's wrong, and so we should stay out of it. You had 4 kind of more liberal justices who say, no, here's a variety of tests that you could use. And Justice Kennedy, in his vote, decided, that case at least, said, well, there may be some test that is developed in the future. I don't know what it is yet. And so the court punted on this issue for a long time. There's cases going on now where the court may decide it. But the search here has been trying to find a test, right? Something analogous to what is in the race context, where it has said you cannot use race as a predominant or primary factor in drawing the lines.
And obviously it's the court, so it has to be a simple test, right?
Something that can be explained to the judges, yes.
So where does that leave us? I mean, I know that the Wisconsin case is going forward using the efficiency gap, and I know it's been controversial in the scientific community whether that's the right test or whether a simple test or whatever. I mean, explain the question in the scientific community about the efficiency gap and whether it's the right test or a sufficient test. You go next, Dave.
Okay, I'll take a crack on that. So how many people have heard of the efficiency gap? Let's start with that. Okay, a few people. All right. Efficiency gap is what's known as a partisan metric, a metric of how unfair a districting might be. And there are a number of different metrics out there that we could talk about later. The efficiency gap was seized on, I think, because it's particularly simple. And it does arguably provide the sort of bright line test that Dmitry was talking about, a judicially, legally manageable standard, something that avoids, I forget which justice had this phrase, but that we don't want to be the judge in endless beauty contests was a phrase from, I don't know which judge that was.
I can't remember which one said it.
Yeah. Right, so they don't want to be playing referee. They want to like set the rules and say, all right, now lower courts, you decide. All right. So let me give 2 ways of thinking about the efficiency gap, and then I think that will segue into Richard Powell, some of your work. If you anyway, so I'm trying to throw you a softball. Get ready. So the original way that the efficiency gap was defined is as follows. I think this is maybe a 10, 15-year-old idea. It's in terms of wasted votes, which I think is a terrible phrase because I don't believe any vote is ever wasted. But here's how the construction goes. So in a given election, if you voted for the loser, that's considered a wasted vote. I voted for lots of losers and don't feel that I've wasted any votes. However, in this parlance, that's the term. And then let's say the winner won with 55% of the vote. Then we would say that 5% of those votes were also wasted. And then we could go district to district and say which party, red or blue, Democrat, Republican, is wasting most votes. And if it was kind of fair, it should average out to 0. And if there's some sort of bias tilt in, then it's going to average out to not 0 and could sort of lean one direction or the other. And I believe the authors of the efficiency gap standards, whose name is I'm not able to sum it up right now, suggested maybe that 0.8 was if the efficiency gap is more than that, that's indication of some sort of extreme partisan gerrymandering. Let me mention another way to think about that, and then I'm going to say why that number 0.8 I'm uncomfortable with. So here's another mathematically equivalent way to think about the efficiency gap. So we've been talking about the vote percent versus the seat percent. Right? So like if the vote is 50-50, you would expect that the seats for whatever you're doing should also be 50-50, that sort of notion of fairness. And if the vote was 55-45, you might expect the seats then would be 55-45, or as close as they could be. But there's what's called sometimes a winner's bonus, or this tendency, right, if districts are competitive, they're going to swing a little more than actually the percentage would be. And so the efficiency gap sort of makes this normative statement that actually we think that according to the efficiency gap, an efficiency gap of 0 would mean that if 55% of the people voted Republican, the Republicans should get 60% of the seats. And if you actually look at how elections go, like that's actually not, empirically there's actually some evidence that kind of happens, maybe on average. But it's fairly arbitrary, but all of these measures of fairness are fairly arbitrary. So those are two different ways of thinking of the efficiency gap. And if the math was a little bit much, you can just say some numerical way of coming up with some sort of partisan bias. So then the question is, what do we make of this number? We need to have some way of giving it a scale. So if like I showed you an animal you've never seen before, like here's a wombat, and you've never seen a wombat before. I've never seen a wombat. And you said, oh, okay, this is a wombat, I get it. And then I said, is that a big wombat? You would say, well, I don't know, you have to show me a lot of other wombats, right? So okay, so we have to compare it to something. And so here is what I think is the wrong way to do that, which is to compare efficiency gaps state to state. And I've seen that done a lot. Journalists do that, the Washington Post does that. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense for the reasons that Richard Powell was talking about, which is that every state is different. It has its own unique political geography. Voters, Republican and Democrat, tend to cluster in different ways for all sorts of historical and legal reasons. And so that makes a comparison between Wisconsin and Maine not informative. So instead, what we need to do is exactly what Richard described, is simulate thousands of other possible districtings in Maine or Wisconsin or Ohio or Maryland, and then see where the actual plan falls in that sort of universe of possibilities. And that's where I think the really interesting research, or some of the most interesting and important and practical research is going on. I don't know quite how to explain that to Justice Roberts, who's been particularly hostile towards anything mathematical or quantitative, but I think for the rest of us, he has. He dismissed it as what, sociological gobbledygook or something. It's really, anyway, so I think so efficiency gap is one among several measures of partisan bias, and the way to kind of get a handle on what that number might mean is simulate a state many different times and see where the actual plan lies compared to other feasible redistrictings for that state or jurisdiction. And and Richard has done some of that work.
Well,
So-
I was just going to say, it's kind of interesting because, like a wombat, right?
Yep.
Like, we know Wisconsin has been gerrymandered. Like, there's not much doubt that there has been something done there. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I think even looking at Wisconsin against its former self, you would probably say something has been done here. So we kind of know it when we see it, but the challenge seems to be explaining it to the court and giving them a bright line. And so I sort of hear this tension between what's right and what's fair and what's real in the political science realm, and sort of, I hate to say dumbing it down, but making it digestible to the justices in a way that they're not going to mistrust the outcome. So with that, go ahead.
So that's exactly what we've been trying to do. We've been trying to figure out a way that you could actually measure this without having to just rely on the sense of, well, you know it when you see it, because there are obvious cases that you know it when you see it, but then there are lots of other cases that you're not quite sure. So we've been working and refining this method of being able to do that over the years. So as Dave mentioned, and I alluded to before, one problem is where people are distributed. I mean, there are places in the United States, New York City, Chicago, and a number of other places where you have hundreds of thousands of people, in some cases millions of people, living in very tight quarters where Democrats outnumber Republicans 5 or 6 or 7 to 1. You couldn't possibly draw districts if you wanted to be the most creative district drawer in the world, that votes weren't going to be wasted. In other words, that they were matching the partisanship of the state overall. But there's some other problems too, because states have different legal standards that they insist upon in the drawing of districts. One is that not every state has the same combination, but there are basically kind of 4 broad categories, I would say. One, states have compactness standards, but there's actually not a settled way of actually figuring out what's compact. Again, it's one of those things we might think we know what it means, but mathematicians fight a lot about this, and some of it's very obscure and difficult to understand, but there are actually some pretty, the different ways of measuring compactness that all kind of make sense to some extent, and so you have to figure out what compactness means. That's one. Another one is that some states say that in drawing district lines, you have to give respect to existing communities of interest, which are very vaguely defined entities, which might mean socioeconomic groups, racial groups, political groups, and so on and so forth, and coming up with an exact way to measure whether or not something is a community of interest is, I don't want to say impossible, but virtually impossible to do in any sort of systematic way, and in part because communities of interest overlap with one another. You might have a racial group, you might be able to divide up the same group of people based on race, and if you were trying to divide them up based on socioeconomic status or religion or partisanship, you might come up with very different lines. So that's a problem. Some states require that congressional districts respect, to some extent, existing political boundaries, such as county boundaries or municipal boundaries, things of that nature. And then finally is a set of legal requirements that's placed on the states by the federal government in the Voting Rights Act and in subsequent court decisions about the Voting Rights Act, which, and this has been the subject of some of what you've seen in North Carolina this year and elsewhere, but that districts, states with significant minority populations have at least some number of what are called majority-minority districts, districts in which minorities comprise a majority of the voters, the idea being that minorities then have an opportunity to elect one of their own in that district to the House of Representatives. So when you put all of this together, states aren't free to just do whatever they want to do. There's a lot of constraints. So what we've done is we've developed a method that takes these various considerations into account as best they can. As I mentioned, some of them are so vague, you can't do a perfect job of that. And what we've done is, what Dave has suggested, is we can go state by state, and we can run within the legal parameters a simulation, a computer-based simulation very quickly, where we can generate 1,000 or 10,000, name the number, just depends on how long you want to sit in front of your computer and wait for the results, possible redistricting plans for a particular state. And so we've done that, and you have some of the data in the table that I handed around that looks like this. And I can just show you briefly, what we've come up with as a result of that. So if you look at the column that says simulations mean and then simulations rounded, the simulations rounded is a rounded version of the mean level. What we've done there is we've created 1,000 redistricting plans in each state. Actually, once you pass 1,000, you can do 1 billion if you want. They really don't do much. They're generating the same plans over and over, and you don't gain much from going higher and higher and higher in the number of simulations you run. But then after we draw each one of those plans, we can then, because we have district or precinct level data, we can then extrapolate the likely partisanship based on past voting patterns of how those simulated districts would vote. And you can look at the partisanship under randomized conditions of what each state would look like. And so that is that column where you see the simulations. So for example, we'll just take Ohio, it's the first line. If you were to draw 1,000 randomized simulations of the state of Ohio and then look at their partisanship, basically on average you get about 8 Republican seats in the state of Ohio. And as what becomes interesting then is to look at those relative to the districts as they're actually drawn today. And so the districts that as they're actually drawn in Ohio today generate 12 Republican seats. So 4 additional Republican seats than they would have otherwise. Now, I should point one thing out. The wording districts as drawn is actually pretty important. These are not the actual voting results. In most states, they're very close. Because actual winners of congressional districts can be based not just on partisanship, but can be subject to all sorts of idiosyncratic things that occur. The existing person might have been a long-term incumbent, and they win despite the fact that their partisanship doesn't match perfectly the partisanship of the district, or somebody was involved in a scandal, or one party ran a much better candidate, or outspent. There are district by district idiosyncratic things that can happen. So what we do here is we take the boundaries of the actual districts and look at the partisanship within those as sort of a baseline against which to compare the actual simulated districts. And so the column that says difference, we would argue, is the column that represents, if you want to call it gerrymandering, I think that's probably getting a little loose with the term, but at least it's the discrepancy between the partisanship of the actual districts relative to the districts that we generate in our randomized simulations. Now, gerrymandering, for a lot of reasons we can talk about, is a very good explanation for what's going on in most of those instances, but there are other possible explanations as well. And in fact, if you look at the bottom of the table, there once in a while are states that have, like Tennessee, that have where the redistricting process was controlled by Republicans, and Republicans are actually generating one less seat than they would be expected to, just based on randomized simulations. So sometimes things don't exactly work out. But what is interesting too is you look at the vast. So there are some states that really stand out as looking really fishy. But then you got to get to this point where there's a lot of states, the vast majority of them, are pretty darn close to what we would expect in the real world. And in some of those states, you would find that the districts don't necessarily match the partisanship of the state for all the reasons that we talked about. But they do match what would be generated from randomized simulations of what you actually could do in the real world in terms of being able to draw those districts.
Okay, so I'm looking at Texas.
Yeah.
And we probably all remember the time that the Texas Republican-controlled legislature sent the state police to Oklahoma to get the Democrats back for the purpose of drawing a partisan map, right? You're telling me that the map the Republicans came up with was a fair map? Is that what I'm hearing?
It's still an overwhelmingly Republican map, but Texas is a fairly overwhelmingly Republican state. But Texas suffers from some of the same problems the situation you mentioned was in the previous round. It was after the 2000 census.
Not after the 2010 one.
It was not after the 2010. It was after the 2000 when they went back and they redrew the boundaries again and again and again.
Thank you.
And Tom DeLay was behind that.
Yes.
And it moved on to other adventures at this point. But that Texas is a state where Democrats are disadvantaged based upon their spatial distribution. But it's an overwhelmingly Republican state. Anyway, and there are states where, Massachusetts, for example. I mean, Democrats are so overwhelmingly in the majority in Massachusetts that Democrats don't have to do anything when they draw the.
Oh, there it's right.
I mean, they, sort of Rhode Island is the same sort of. Now you might see, actually Maine is a good example of a state where it shows the difference between when I said districts as drawn versus the actual districts. So if you look at Maine's 2nd district where I live, and you make a projection of the election outcome just based on partisanship, you come up with a kind of narrow Democratic district. It's currently the seat is held by Bruce Poliquin, and in his 2nd term a Republican. But again, there's a lot going into that. What's happened in the 2nd district isn't just a sort of straight down the line partisan vote based on traditional patterns. So,
I mean, I haven't heard by any measure that Maine has been considered a heavily gerrymandered or extremely gerrymandered state. So this is sort of one of the questions that we have for you all. Like, why should we care if other states are engaging in extreme partisan gerrymandering? And we're doing okay here at Maine, right? You want to take a crack at that?
Well, it's a national issue, right? So we're talking about the national government. This is, you look at the number here, it's 15 is the difference. And it's probably not quite enough to get the House. I think the margin's slightly higher. That's around 12.
Well, the 15 really matters here, right? Because the natural difference in the simulation gives a slight edge to Democrats. So if you're going to divide up the House equally, it'd be 217 and a half for each, right? So there's a slight Democrat, but that. So I would say that 15. It's probably not as big of a number as you might expect based upon the volume of complaining that you get out of Democrats. I mean, if you sort of watch, gerrymandering discussions on MSNBC, you'd think that Republicans stole, 100 seats in the last election. But that 15 is, because of where it falls, is really consequential, right? Because control of the House switches from one party to the other when you cross over that 217, 218 dividing line. So it's only 15 seats, which is 3 or 4% of all the seats in the United States, but it's consequential because those seats and where they're falling is flipping control of the House of Representatives.
Yeah, so we're talking about federalism, so we have kind of two sovereigns here, right? So for Maine, it's true that within the state it does make a big difference, but for kind of all of our national policy, this is maybe one of the most important issues in all of politics, right? Because it really kind of underlies all of the other substantive issues of the law. I think Justice Warren, when he stepped down, he was the judge behind Miranda and Brown v. Board of Education. I mean, really classic cases. And he was asked when he retired, what do you think is the most influential case you decide, most important case of the Warren Court? Reynolds v. Sims, he said, the one person, one vote, right? So one person, one vote, and how we draw the lines here is what decides all of the other substantive issues, right? So that's why it's so important. These 15 votes make a big difference.
Yeah. Now, before we turn to audience questions, because we've only got a half an hour left, I want to give Rich Taylor a chance to talk about the census, because none of this is any good without good census data. And some things are happening regarding the census. So why don't you talk about some of the changes and issues that are confronting our 2020 census?
Well, the challenge the census has had and always has is, of course, funding. It's not unique to any other agency in that regard. They're always going to have to count more people. Probably will be, we hope, for some time. They want every person counted once and in the right place is really ultimately what they're focused on for a variety of reasons. Right now, it's an amazing story to sit back and look at what it takes to put together what is a housing and population decennial census. That's the real name of it. The census does a lot of stuff. But that begins essentially when the previous one is done. They're doing an evaluation of how, for instance, the 2010 census worked, how well the operation worked, and that evaluation is the basis for the planning for the next one. They'll finish the 2020 census essentially in 2023 when the evaluation is done again and they start moving forward. Over the course of that time, they go through all kinds of testing. They usually begin with looking at things like what's going to be the new technology we'll use to make sure we get all count everyone and do it efficiently. They'll go through and they'll look at new types of canvassing, all kinds of testing, and eventually, right now, they're up to the point where they're going to do what's called the end-to-end test. They take two areas. I think one's in Washington State and the other one's in Rhode Island, and they're going to do front-to-back test to see how everything integrates together and works. The way they canvass people, directly, they're calling them, giving them backup postcards, mailing, how it all comes together and works. So there's a lot that goes on. And as far as I know right now, that is scheduled. That will take place in 2018. It'll begin next month, as a matter of fact. And so they're on schedule as much as I can be aware of. There have been concerns as Ann was mentioning. There's always the funding issue because it's just an awesome big task to do and do it right. And where that really translates into a potential problem is if they can't do all the tests they'd like to do to make sure it's good data, they're going to be very, very worried, obviously, that some of the data may not be as good as they would have liked. That's where that's come into place. But I'm not aware of any of these tests, thus far at least, not being completed. So that's a good thing. But again, it costs a lot of money, and it's never gotten cheaper than it was in the previous one because technology is changing. People are moving. One good thing the census has been showing us from a housing perspective, and it might help the census people, is we're probably the least mobile we've ever been for a couple of decades right now. When you look at the mobility in the United States and in Maine too, you don't see much movement. And maybe it's easier to count people if they're staying in one place.
And they're changing some of the questions, right? Like they're gonna
Well,
change where they
well, they're not
count
changing them
incarcerated
anymore.
people, and they're gonna change where they're counting military serving
Right.
people, and then the citizenship question has been
Yes.
high profile.
And those have all, the subjects, the questions asked have all been sent to, well, subjects have been sent to Congress, and that's essentially pretty much the same as it was in 2010 and 2000 for the most part. Now they're finalizing the questions that will go to Congress too. So, again, in a nutshell, they seem to be on schedule. I'm sure, like you said, their primary concern would be that they get all this testing done
Right,
on schedule.
and the money to do the job.
Right.
All right, we've got, I think, almost a half an hour left. Should we turn to some audience questions at this point? Anne?
Yeah, hi. I'm interested in whether you think there's going to be a growing influence of independence on the party, on the discussion of gerrymandering and redistricting. I mean, I know, for example, in my district in Maine, when I look at it, it's now majority unenrolled. And then it's Republicans, and then it's Democrats. And, I think that the unenrolled, there's a whole spectrum from conservative to liberal. So I don't know how that will play out when you go to redistrict.
Anybody?
So from a political science standpoint, unenrolleds and independents are really interesting. And part of the reason why is that we have this idea, we have this sort of idealized idea, a version of what independents are in our minds, like really educated people who kind of agree with Republicans and kind of agree with Democrats, and so they sit down and they independently make their judgment, come each election. I mean, that's actually not what most independents or unenrolled voters are. There's a large category of people who are sort of tuned out and apathetic, and don't really have a very sound understanding about what's really going on in the political system anyway. And then there's a decent number of people, pretty good number of people who claim themselves to be unenrolled or independents, and they're actually closet partisans. And so political scientists actually, one way they measure partisanship is on a sort of 7-point scale from kind of most Republican to most Democrat. And the middle three categories are sort of independent, lean Republican, independent, lean Democrat. And one of the interesting things that political science has been finding for decades is that the independents who lean are actually much more loyal voters to their political party in their voting than are the partisans, the weaker partisans in each political party. So we do have a lot of independent vote. Maine has a really independent streak, and I think independents always have a good opportunity to win in Maine. Most states they don't. We live in a very polarized environment in most places in the United States, so we're different. I mean, there's a handful of places that are like Maine, I think, where that can happen. Alaska and maybe New Hampshire, and I mean, it's hard. You run out of places pretty quickly. Some of the mountain states, maybe.
When it's legislatures that do this, right? When they sit down with their map drawing computers to do reapportionment, can they tell at that granular level on the 7-point scale who's in the district and carve it up like that?
So there's no master database. I mean, there's no master database of vote returns, right? I mean, because we have secret ballot, we don't know how people vote. But the short answer is, if you tell data experts a few key things about the voters, they can guess with near perfect accuracy how somebody's likely to vote.
So they do.
So they do.
Yeah. Another question? Go ahead.
I have a question about the census. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm just pointing that I saw those questions back there. I'll go after you.
The census, and what might affect it? For instance, increased deportation, is that going to have a big effect on the 2020 census? The fact that the DACA recipients are being offered possible citizenship but not for 12 years, those kind of things. How big of an effect will that have?
Well, that's a concern because, for instance, in this current climate, there's concerns that some of these people are going to be less visible than they were. because they don't want to be visible for some reasons, and they're not going to be counted, if you will. So yeah, it could affect the accounts.
In a big way?
Well, when you think of the makeup of the entire country, the population as a whole, it's hard for me to say in a big way. Yeah, it will have, it could have big effects in certain areas.
And it could have, you know, a small effect layer on top of a lot of other small effects. You know,
Yeah.
like we're talking about our 15 House districts here, 2 or 3% of voter suppression, a percent or a half a percent on something else. You know, and these things keep coming together. Yeah. John, did you have your hand up?
No,
Debbie?
You know what my question is.
Good. Go ahead.
My question as we start to talk about gerrymandering is why can't we move to a proportional system? I have been sitting in a district for years with representatives that don't talk to me because we don't share any interests and they're not answering my calls and answering my notes. Whereas if we were voting proportionally, that area would be electing at least some people that would be able to carry my concerns to the legislature.
What is the legal, my understanding is that there's no, what is the legal status of proportionality?
Well,
Could we do that if we wanted to?
Sure, it would require some change, right? I mean, I think the best answer to that is probably history, right? Kind of historical default of this is how we vote. We have single-member districts and we vote for one person, right? So, is there a good policy reason for that? I'm not so sure, and certainly legally, there's flexibility. But you know, kind of historically, this nation has done it that way, and we've kind of stuck with it.
It's my understanding that for the House of Representatives nationally, multi-member districts are currently against the law because they had been set up to disenfranchise minorities. But that's when you do a vote for one system.
Yeah.
So we're moving towards ranked choice voting and these sorts of systems. It's really quite plausible to put together multi-member systems that are there.
Yeah, I think it's a question of design, right? So I think you can design a fair proportional system that doesn't run into the kind of Voting Rights Act concerns, right? When you have 40% minority district that gets nobody in office, so then you start designing these smaller districts to ensure that minorities get people in office. That's a matter of statute, right? Statute kind of requires, and that's an important factor as kind of the legislatures design their districts. So thinking about, okay, we can't go down. There's kind of Voting Rights Act pressure. Once you have majority minority districts, it's going to be presumed illegal if you've lowered the number of those districts. And that has been kind of pushing at odds with Democrats' interests sometimes, right? You kind of pack a whole bunch of minorities in one district, it becomes a packed Democratic district that preserves a minority winner in that district. But you can design a proportionality system that would comply with the Constitution, comply with the Voting Rights Act. I'm just not sure if there's any other explanation other than we've never done it that way.
And the politics of reform
Right.
is hard, right? We know that all too well. Right. I think somebody back there, Anna, then come back to John and then to
Well,
Helen.
Debbie asked exactly my question, you know, geography is a problem, can we get rid of looking at geography at all? But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how we do districting in Maine and just the systems that we have in place. I'm not sure if everyone knows how it works here.
Who's got the answer to that one? Don't be shy if you know something.
I am not a Maine expert, and so I'm not going to answer that question directly. But I do want to highlight that different states take very different approaches. And so some states leave it up to the legislature. I believe that's what our state does. I mean, I don't know the details of that, but and that can lead to some very strong partisan gerrymandering in both directions, to be pointed out. Some states, I believe, have a panel of judges do it, and others have a bi or non-partisan commission do it. My pretty strong sense is we want to get it out of the legislature, and my strong sense is that bipartisan or non-partisan commissions, I think using some of these statistical tools that we've been talking about, computational tools, would lead to much fairer districts. And if I can go back to the proportionality question, I think for me, one of the things that's interesting and also challenging about gerrymandering, and it's not like a math problem independent of history. There's a long history that this is sort of in the midst of, both in terms of disenfranchisement of African American voters and now Latina voters in all sorts of different ways. And so the Voting Rights Act, to me, not as a lawyer, but from my perspective, has been stunningly effective in remedying historical harm. And so I'm nervous about, and that's based on districting, so I'm a little nervous about sort of throwing that out, even though I fundamentally, I think, agree with you. And then also, I think, and this speaks also to the question of why is this an issue for Maine, I think we're seeing voting under attack in all sorts of different ways across the country right now. Gerrymandering is one of them, but restrictive and racist voter ID laws is another. It's all, to me, sort of part of the big issue, and we all, even here in Maine, in my opinion, need to push against that, because the right to vote is an absolutely fundamental right.
Does anybody else want to answer Anna's question about how Maine does it?
Maine has a situation where the legislature has to approve plans that are devised by a commission that exists for the sake of. And actually, Maine, relative to the previous question, you can say something I think interesting about Maine too, in the sense that, so if you move to a system of proportionality, that seems to be attractive for a lot of people, and especially nowadays when our politics seem to be centered around partisanship based around increasingly ideological viewpoints. But so that's one system. The model that we've had has been more of a geographic-based system in the sense that, and it's not just for partisan reasons or something like that, but that there was a notion that our elected representatives should represent people within a particular community. And that was sort of the best way for representation to exist, to be rooted in a community, to be representing that community, and that community would have a voice, rather than representing sort of an abstract political ideology through a much larger proportional division. And you can see where that plays out in the state of Maine. Maine is not a heavily gerrymandered. There's not a lot you can do with Maine because the fact that we only have 2 districts but the way our population is distributed, you could do some interesting things with it. Like right now, and traditionally in recent decades, right, we've had a district that's basically Portland and southern coastal and inland Maine, which is heavily Democratic, and then the rest of the state, which by the way is the largest geographic district in the United States, east of the Mississippi, land-wise, area-wise. And so you have a district that's by and large sort of, urban, a little bit more cosmopolitan, at least by Maine standards, right, than the rest of the state. Much more progressive in its political ideas, and then a state, and then a more rural part of the state elsewhere. You could theoretically, instead, think about this. You could, and this is, people have thrown out this idea, but what would happen if you took a line and sort of drew it diagonally all the way from, the Berwicks up to Fort Kent, right? And had to, that would offend our geographic sense that you're dividing this population of people in southern Maine who have fairly, kind of distinct political viewpoints, and you're splitting them apart. Other people have suggested that, well, in some ways that would actually be better because rural Maine would then, there would be an incentive for the representative from the 1st District of Maine to also pay attention to the interests of people from rural Maine because they would have a substantial number of those people in their district, and it would kind of have a balancing effect on our delegation. So there's, and then you sort of play this out state by state, and the implications are different elsewhere, but the notions that we have historically about representation or what you should be representing when you're in a legislature are maybe evolving to the extent that people are more calling for proportional partisan representation.
Coming back to John, you had your hand up, right?
Yeah, I was just wondering if anyone would comment. We're looking at these I don't know what you call them, partisan proportionality measures there, and I was wondering if you could comment on the relationship between that and overrepresentation or underrepresentation of urban or rural areas. Is there any way in which these numbers kind of line up and support each other? Could some of this, for example,
understand your question. I think this goes back to something that Richard Powell was talking about, and I don't know that you use the term, but sometimes there's a tendency to self-gerrymander or self-pack. And so, you know, and you use the example of Wisconsin and saying everybody knows this is gerrymandering. But there are some people who will say with a straight face, no, actually this isn't gerrymandered. This is so many Democrats living in Milwaukee, and then you've got Madison, and then you've got the rest of it. And so it's not our fault, people would say, that Democrats choose to cluster up so much. And I think this sort of self-gerrymandering unarguably is a thing. That's an effect. And so I think if you do these sorts of these randomized simulations, and you say, what would happen if the vote shifted over to 50-50, it's very hard to end up with 50-50. So the sort of inherent political geography of most states favors Republicans for the reasons I just described. And so the people who are trying to defend Wisconsin have at least a little bit of truth behind that statement. But then these computational techniques let you show that that's only a tiny fraction of the whole story. So I think some people who do, and I'm not myself an active researcher in gerrymandering, but my sense is people in that area have some disagreement over how big an effect is self-gerrymandering. But I think almost everybody who's looked at it, certainly this is my opinion, would say there's no way that self-gerrymandering can explain all of it. And the beauty of the computational technique, the power of the computational technique, is that it lets it sort of, you can kind of pull apart those two things. And that's also why you shouldn't compare states to states, because they're so different in terms of their inherent political geography.
And it's not just the numbers now. I mean, we have statements, right? So at one point in history, you know, politicians at least have the decency to lie that, you know, this is just kind of happening that way. But now you look at North Carolina, you have a state representative saying, look, we're going in and we're trying to draw the district that will yield as many Republicans as possible. Everything says it's on the record. Right?
Two quick things on that. One, in the House, I think it's not a big issue. But in the Senate, it's absolutely an issue by the design of the Constitution, right? I mean, the state of South Dakota gets the same representation as the state of New York. So in the United States Senate, it's absolutely the case about the over-representation of rural, sparsely populated areas. There's no doubt about it.
That's not a gerrymandering issue.
No, that's not a gerrymandering issue. That's in the design of the Constitution. Dmitry mentioned North Carolina. This idea of majority-minority districts that I referred to. We have a study that we're working on now, and we just started to generate the data. We haven't written up the results yet, but doing the same sorts of things. When the court first started insisting on majority-minority districts, Republicans were really offended. What do you mean? This is affirmative action. This is ridiculous. We're creating artificial districts on race. And then Republicans sort of figured out pretty quickly that this was actually significantly working to their political advantage, because what you were doing was, where Dave was talking about hacking, you were taking black voters, which vote overwhelmingly Democratic, and packing them into districts for the sake of creating an African-American seat, and that made it much easier for Republicans to win elsewhere. So that's one area, the requirement for majority-minority districts and their support among progressives actually is undercutting progressive representation a bit, even though it may be satisfying progressive desire to see a more diverse legislature in terms of racial representation.
Yeah, thanks. Helen, did you have a question?
Yes. The idea of public disclosure of one's party affiliation, I wonder if there are drawbacks to that. Thinking of a small island community where people actually choose not to become affiliated with the party because they know that if they did, certain contracts might be withheld or job opportunities might be withheld. I'm wondering if you've run across that in your research or in the whole idea of the unaffiliated voter.
Anybody?
I think it's similar to the idea that Richard talked about earlier, that even if you don't have that information, certainly for this purpose, you can kind of try to gather it, figure it out. One of the reasons that Gill is being litigated the way it is that this is the Wisconsin case. It's being argued as a kind of First Amendment case that the government is retaliating against voters based on their political affiliation, right? So there is this kind of notion that the state legislature or the executive branch shouldn't take a government action against citizens based on who they voted for. Right? So there is some of that protection built in, and so to the extent that the court has struggled to think about these as equal protection cases, there is a First Amendment element here, that there shouldn't be retaliation against you based on how you voted. So I want to say it's very hard to prove, right? And so I think for the gerrymandering piece, whether the people drawing the maps have the data or not, they can still figure out how to draw themselves a safe enough district without needing everybody's identification.
The safe enough, I'm not going to get into it, but later if you want to take a look at it, the last page of the handout that I drew, that's actually the second part of it. This is really competitive. We're focusing solely on the partisan nature of gerrymandering, but if you look at the redistricting process, this thing, this table does the same thing that we did simulated versus districts as drawn, but instead of looking at which party wins, we look at how competitive the elections are. And you actually see a bigger effect on competitiveness than you do on partisanship. And the current redistricting processes as they exist are drawing significantly less competitive districts, which I actually think in many ways is a bigger story than the partisanship. I think one of the most unfortunate things that we have in our politics today is that almost nobody lives in a district that could be won by either party. I happen to live in one in the 2nd District of Maine, but there's maybe, depending upon how you count it, somewhere between 60 and 75 such districts in the United States nowadays. The vast majority are always going to be won by a Republican or always going to be won by a Democrat. You could sit here and project the election outcomes with near total certainty, barring something really strange, like happened in the Alabama Senate race this year, where there's a really compromised candidate. And so I think if you're worried about polarization and the nastiness in our politics, which I very much am, and spend a lot of time on that issue at the Cohen Institute and restoring civility, I think one of the best things you could do would be to create districts that are more competitive between Republicans and Democrats, and kind of restore that balance that we had within districts.
One question back there, go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm Kevin Lammer from Augusta. I just were introducing yourselves. I kind of feel it's really a question, but it's more, I kind of have some information that's on target to Anna's question, which she might have asked partly because I had asked about it right before it wouldn't be, but Maine has a 2/3 requirement. So you have to, in order for a plaintiff to pass in Maine, it used to be just for legislature, but now it's for Congress too. In county commission districts, you have to have 2/3 in each house to pass it, which usually a party doesn't have 2/3, so you need to draw competitive. There still is the possibility of having bipartisan gerrymanders, like tweaking districts to help each incumbent. I do know that in 2013 it was believed that the Garrett Mason district was tweaked in a way to benefit him. Calling the Hovage, now Madigan, her district was tweaked in a way to benefit her, but she ended up losing anyway. So it's not, partly because Maine has a high swing voters, even bipartisan gerrymandering is difficult. But I just want to say we do have a 2/3 requirement, and we also have restrictions in the legislature about splitting like a town like Augusta with 2.17 districts. We have to have 2 districts entirely in Augusta and just one other one.
Thanks. And I'm going to comment on that. I think he was sort of answering the question about how Maine does it, that we didn't get a full answer to it before.
No, that's great. Thank you.
You had a question up here? Go ahead.
I have a question, just want to ask the panel to speculate how things would change if at some point in the future we have a viable third party.
I think that's a political science question.
It's a dream of many people that I think is extremely unlikely to occur for a couple reasons. One has to do with the structure of our elections, the fact that we have single-member districts rather than proportional representation weighs heavily strategically on the formation of 2 large parties that aggregate interests. And I think the other big reason is that, and I think you've seen examples of this where there have been sort of nascent third parties or independent movements if they tend to become successful in any way, the existing political parties are extremely skilled at absorbing those movements and incorporating their viewpoints. And if you look at sort of Ross Perot in 1990 and 1992, when he ran mainly on the deficit, if you want to sort of characterize it in one issue, you suddenly had Democrats talking about controlling the deficit, and Republicans at that time were concerned about that. So the parties tend to absorb those. So I think there's a better chance of. That doesn't mean a candidate couldn't win a race, but I think probably a viable, permanent third party is unlikely. You might have a new party come into existence that replaces over time one of the existing political parties, but I think the incentive structures in the way that our the mathematical incentive structures in the way that our elections are organized favors or has a strong bias towards the preservation of a two-party system.
I would add to that, and maybe this is also to start final comments. And I say this with a little bit of sadness, as someone who in the past has voted for third-party candidates, and has those same sort of longings and longing for proportionality. I think the system we have is a system we're going to have for a while. And particularly since over the last year and several months, that seemed even more urgent to me to make the current system we have fairer for more people. And I love playing what-if games, and I teach wonderful, incredibly enthusiastic and creative students at College of Atlantic who come up with, what if we had a third party, or why didn't we do it this way? And I usually say, we need to just focus on the system we have now because there's so many threats to voting. So again, that's what it goes back to why I think this is a super important issue. I'm glad we're having, grateful for this conversation. And I think it does, although it doesn't affect Maine directly, it might a little bit at the state level. It's a huge, one of the most pressing national concerns. And I also think, and I'll end with this, I think this has the potential to be a bipartisan issue. Some amicus briefs for the appellants in the Gill case in Wisconsin were filed by John Kane and John Kasich. So there are good men and women on both sides of the aisle who are saying this is harming the country, this is harming our states. And right now it's hard for me looking forward in this moment to find a lot of things we can be bipartisan on. And if this is something that we can, maybe particularly here in Maine, and that's another role that Maine can play. We have this independent streak, we have a bipartisan streak. I've lived here 20 years, I still don't really get Maine politics. It's weird, but in a good way, right? There's some openings here, and maybe it's a chance for us to lead.
Party comments? Would you like to?
No.
Okay.
Well, I'll have one kind of respond to that question, and then kind of building off of what David said. So, as far as the third party, one of the problems with the kind of ends drawing the lines is that very problem, right? When you see a rise, when you see a threat, you change the rules, you draw lines in a way to help yourself, right? And that's why I think the idea of having neutral commissions, citizens commissions like California, or independent commissions doing it, that at least addresses some of that concern where it can't be blatantly partisan. Now, of course, there's questions about what is really nonpartisan, who's nonpartisan, who picks those people, right? So there's no kind of perfect answer here. But the idea that the legislatures are picking who their voters are going to be, that's inconsistent with any kind of changes in the law. I agree this is a bipartisan issue in the abstract, right? I think most people hearing this say it's kind of ridiculous that this is going on. But once you're in power, you have an incentive to keep that going, right? So if you are the legislator who won under this system, then you like the system, right? And so that's why it's so hard to get changes done once you know who's benefiting from it in any particular state.
So I'll just sum by saying I was thinking after I answered your question, I actually would argue that we did have a third-party candidate in the last presidential election. I mean, Donald Trump is essentially, he hasn't governed so much as well, but he essentially was an independent presidential candidate who just basically exercised a hostile takeover of the Republican Party against its will throughout most of the primaries. I would argue that the whole campaign for the first, 6 or 8 months was Republicans trying to find some alternative, but they were fractured and couldn't come together and figure it out. So I think that's the more typical route. The last thing I'll mention is when this tends to get gerrymandering posed as a partisan issue nowadays, and Democrats, I think, are especially gleeful at pointing out the results like we had here about the extent to which Republicans seem to be benefiting from it. But I would caution that that's largely a function, in my view, of the fact that the Republicans controlled more state legislatures after the 2010 election. And personally, I have no doubt that if the roles were reversed after the next election, that Democrats would gleefully use the redistricting process to do the same sorts of things that Republicans just did. So I think ultimately, if you want to come up with a solution that's manageable, it does have to be a bipartisan solution, and it has to have some sort of measurable criteria that could be imposed by the courts.
But that's where the people can be active, right? So groups like this, League of Women Voters, have done so much work on the ground. I mean, I worked on, with the on this ranked choice voting issue, right? So whatever the Supreme Court does, that's the U.S. Supreme Court. But a lot of work can be done at the state level with state constitutional amendments and changing the rules of what can be done in any particular state, right? So recently the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down the Pennsylvania map, which was gerrymandered under the state constitution, and there's nothing the U.S. Supreme Court could really do with it, right? So if you're relying on state constitutional law or state law, that's another avenue where you can kind of be active and get involved, and it's a lot easier to get a constitutional amendment or even legislation passed at the state level than at the national level.
All right, we run out of time, so we'll call it good. I see a question in the back, but maybe you could ask it offline as you're breaking up. Round of applause for the panel.
Thank you, everyone, for a great day and for sticking out through a long day in the State House. So nice to see you all.